Hello and welcome. Stephen Hawthorne here. Let's see what awaits us in today's program. The Eastern Campaign posed such a huge logistical challenge that the likelihood of a logistical crisis was not only very probable, but predictable from the start. Logistics determines efficiency on the battlefield. If an army has efficient logistics, it means you can fight. There is a saying, logistic is not everything, but everything would be nothing without logistic. On the battlefield or even in war movies, the significance and impact of logistics are not obviously seen. In history books, we follow battles, the decisions of commanders, the movements of individual divisions or armies. We read descriptions of fights for cities and hills. We observe assaults on specific positions. Often, in these same books, there is not a word about what makes these movements possible at all. We do not consider why a commander at the operational or tactical level did or did not carry out a specific task. We do not ponder why, despite a victory, the army suffered such heavy losses. This could have happened due to a lack of artillery ammunition of a specific caliber or a shortage of sufficient fuel. This is a fundamental element in the military. Logistics determines efficiency on the battlefield. If an army has efficient logistics, it means you can fight. It does not immediately determine victory or defeat, but it ensures that the army can continue its operations. If logistics fail, even the greatest commander often has their hands tied. During World War II, the outcomes of campaigns were entirely dependent on the efficiency of the logistical system. The German invasion of Poland in 1939 or France in 1940 looked the way they did on both sides of the conflict precisely because of logistical reasons. Later, the German invasion on the Soviet Union progressed and concluded with specific results primarily due to logistical reasons. The successes and failures of the Afrika Korps in the North African desert also depended on logistics. The liberation of France by the most technically advanced Allied army, and at the same time the most powerful army in the world at that time, was also based on logistics. If the logistical system was inefficient, it caused the halt of powerful armies, even if they faced significantly smaller enemy forces. Erwin Rommel's tanks in 1941 had to halt their advance due to logistical problems. A similar fate befell the offensive towards Moscow in the same year. The same situation occurred when the American army, which had quickly defeated German forces in Normandy, halted and significantly slowed its march towards the German border. In all these cases, the offensives collapsed due to logistical reasons, even though the enemy had smaller and weaker forces at that moment. Logistics, just like armies during war, must be considered on three levels: the strategic level, operational level, and tactical level. The means of transport at the strategic level are ships and trains. At the operational level, it is mainly railways and, for shorter distances, road transport. At the lowest tactical level, road transport dominates. Using the example of Nazi Germany, a factory or producer manufactures a specific product in the form of a tank, a cannon, a rifle bullet, or even boots or a can of food. From the factory, it reaches central warehouses by train. From these warehouses, it travels by another train to zones near the front lines to frontline depots. From the frontline depots, supplies are delivered directly to the troops using motorized or horse-drawn road transport. In the case of a country like the USA, the strategic stage includes sea transport by ship to carry supplies across the ocean to another continent. If the war is positional in nature, like the World War I, building such a system is simple but resource-intensive. Simple because communication lines are not frequently captured or destroyed by the enemy, at least not as often as was the case later in the World War II. If the war is dynamic, like the World War II, where maneuvering and constantly changing front lines are crucial, logistical issues become a tremendous challenge. In such a war, besides the number of rifles, tanks, and airplanes, it is also important to consider how many cars, fuel reserves, locomotives, and wagons each side has at its disposal. How much steel can be allocated for the production of rails and locomotives versus new tanks? It then becomes apparent that a locomotive or truck is just as important as a tank or airplane. A dysfunctional logistical system, for example, was one of the fundamental reasons for Poland's rapid defeat in 1939. In a way, the inadequacy of Poland's logistical system later hindered the Germans in their conquest of the USSR. Intrigued? Stay tuned for the next part of the program to learn more. Poland in 1939 had a completely dysfunctional logistical system. When Commander-in-Chief Lend-Lease, along with the Polish command, received reports that the German army, due to the number of vehicles it had, would conduct a maneuver-based war, they decided that Poland would also defend itself in a maneuver-based way. The problem was that Polish logistics were completely unsuited to this type of warfare. Poland did not have sufficient transport means to efficiently supply the army. Most importantly, it did not have an adequate number of locomotives and wagons. The railway network itself was not sufficiently developed for trains to reach everywhere and in large quantities. In the frontline zones, they also did not have an adequate number of road transport vehicles, such as cars, trucks, or efficient horse-drawn wagons, although supplies of specific types of ammunition would have lasted for up to 3 months of fighting. Hundreds of thousands of shells never left the ammunition depots. There was no effective way to supply the army from the frontline depots, which, due to the dynamic nature of the war, did not have time to send out their supplies. The Polish army relied on requisitioning horse-drawn wagons from the civilian economy for its mobilization. During the mobilization, officers compiled lists of motorized and horse-drawn vehicles that could be drafted into the army in case of war. In practice, this system completely failed. There was a lack of modern motorized vehicles in large quantities that could transport such a significant amount of supplies. The situation was similar with horse-drawn wagons. Both the cars and horse-drawn wagons varied in quality, and not all were suitable for transporting the same amount of materials. Despite having a considerable number of divisions, the supply delivery system using horse-drawn and motorized wagons was insufficient. It operated with delays and could not keep up with the constantly changing front line. It often happened that ammunition was sent to places where Polish troops were no longer present, as they had either withdrawn, been defeated, or encircled. At a higher operational level, the railway needed, according to the plans, up to 2 weeks to deploy the armed forces to their operational positions. Importantly, during this time, it did not supply the already deployed and fighting troops. This was a planned action. New ammunition, necessary materials, and reservists, meant to replenish losses in the fighting divisions, were to start being transported 2 weeks after the commencement of hostilities. In the first 2 weeks of the war, the railway transported soldiers, reservists, equipment, and ammunition to the deployment locations of new divisions. The divisions that were already deployed and fighting had to wait 2 weeks for supplies until the railway system was redirected to their needs. This was planned because it was realized that there were too few trains, wagons, and most importantly, railway lines to perform both tasks simultaneously. The Polish railway capacity was not growing. Similarly to the German one, despite the German railway being much more developed, the problem was similar. In both these countries, this element did not develop properly before the war. Interestingly, the inadequacy of both the German and Polish railway networks caused huge problems for the German army in their further conquests in the East. We will explain this in the next part of the program. When Hitler came to power in the 1930s, he dreamed of a fully modernized German army, not only in terms of combat, means such as tanks and armored cars. The Germans wanted cars and trucks to largely replace railways. This led to a halt in locomotive production. It was argued that maneuver warfare would be so fast that trucks would deliver supplies more quickly than trains. However, this solution had its drawbacks. Even a massive convoy of trucks transports less cargo than a few trains on a double-track railway line. For short distances, trucks are not a bad solution, especially in areas with low railway density, but for long distances, railways are definitely better. Over long distances of 200, 300, and more kilometers, disadvantages such as fuel consumption in trucks, equipment maintenance, and its handling become significantly pronounced. Germany, as a country, had a deficit of rubber and oil for the production of tires, fuels, and lubricants. However, they had large quantities of coal and and steel, which they mined and produced. Despite developing synthetic rubber and fuels, they did not solve this problem by the end of the war. When the war broke out, Germany also adapted some vehicles from the civilian economy for the army. This temporarily increased transport capacity, but worsened standardization. Germany had over 100 types of trucks and 50 types of cars, leading to maintenance problems. Each vehicle required different spare parts for specific models. At one point in the war, the German army had nearly 2,000 different types of mechanized vehicles, making effective maintenance practically impossible. Field workshops had huge problems with this. It was similar with tank parts. Often, each manufacturer required different parts for replacing components in their machines. Operations in Poland and France already showed that accidents, combat actions, and even normal wear and tear caused the German army to lose about 2,500 trucks per month on average, even before the war with the USSR. They produced about 1,000 per month. This fact led German logisticians to assume that the longer the war lasted, the weaker the German army's supply capabilities would become, which in turn would worsen its operational capabilities. Increasing truck production was hampered by shortages of rubber and rubber compound, which was also needed to produce road wheels for tanks. During the invasion of France, German tanks had gasoline engines, so they could refuel at gas stations during the attack. During the invasion of the USSR, this was not possible because the Soviet Union used lower-octane gasoline. Soviet tanks ran on diesel fuel. Therefore, captured fuel supplies were often unusable until they were processed. Some German commanders before the war with the USSR wisely argued that compared to conditions in the West, the Eastern Campaign posed such a huge logistical challenge that the likelihood of a logistical crisis was not only very probable but predictable from the start. A German victory, if it were to come at all, had to come quickly. We mentioned that both the Polish and German railway networks contributed to logistical problems in the East. In 1939, Poland had fewer steam locomotives and railway wagons than in 1931. Germany also had fewer trains in 1939 than in 1918, when the previous World War ended. They still had significantly more steam locomotives than Poland and possessed a much more developed railway system, allowing them to quickly concentrate troops in a chosen direction in just a few days. The German railway was therefore sufficiently well developed to conquer Poland or France, but was already too poor to conquer the USSR. They faced an unsolvable problem. Before the war, the Polish railway network was poor, so the Germans had to modernize it before attacking the Soviet Union. As part of their preparations for the invasion, they began a gigantic expansion of the logistical base in the part of Poland occupied by the German army. The eastern part of Poland was then occupied by the Red Army under the pre-war Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, a German-Soviet non-aggression pact and division of influence in Europe, which resulted in the joint attack on Poland in September 1939. In the German-occupied territories of Poland, mostly known as the General Government, new railway stations, bridges, airports, and warehouses were built. All necessary infrastructure was needed to quickly transport and deploy divisions preparing for Operation Barbarossa. However, they could modernize the railway network in the conquered lands of Poland that were occupied by their troops. The second, eastern part of Poland, occupied by Soviet forces, for obvious reasons, did not undergo such modernization. This meant that after crossing the border, the Germans entered areas with low railway density, insufficient for their logistical needs. When the war broke out, the Germans were able to execute deep, rapid strikes relying on their logistics supported by trucks to a depth of up to 400 kilometers. This is a distance that allows, despite significant challenges, to supply the army in one strike without as much reliance on railways. They could conquer Poland in this way. Later, they could also occupy Belgium and France in one strike. Within such distances, truck columns could deliver supplies from warehouses or advanced railway stations. Germany amassed the capability to transport up to 60,000 tons of materials using motorized columns under wartime conditions. However, each day, one German infantry division consumed approximately 200 tons of materials, while an armored division used around 300 tons. Taking this into account and when making calculations, the daily demand of the Wehrmacht in 1941 for ammunition, food, and fuel amounted to about 60,000 tons, a figure equivalent to their capacity in motorized columns. Therefore, Germany assumed that in the initial phase of the war with the Soviet Union, they would supply their army using this motorized system capable of meeting daily army needs. However, when the operation in the East began, and the transport columns had to operate on extended communication lines stretching 200, 300, 400 kilometers or more, their truck fleet quickly began to deteriorate. Due to the lack of standardization in German vehicles, within 3 months, their truck columns were worn down to the extent that they were only able to deliver 40, 50, or at most 60% of the required materials. The failure of Barbarossa stemmed from 2 main interrelated reasons. The first reason was the scale of losses. During the summer of 1941, the German army suffered enormous losses that needed to be replenished. In less than 3 months, casualties amounted to 400,000 soldiers. The Wehrmacht was unable to replace such large losses inflicted by the Red Army in such a short time. This was due to the second reason. The second reason for the defeat was the breakdown of the logistical system. Alongside replenishing troops, there was also the urgent need to replenish expended ammunition. The ground forces were consuming millions of tons of ammunition, and Germany logistically struggled to keep up. Often, Germany couldn't transport the equipment and supplies they possessed to the front lines. For example, tanks or winter uniforms couldn't reach the East by rail for months due to insufficient trains, a sparse railway network that was additionally damaged by the retreating Red Army. Those railways that weren't destroyed or damaged still required modification due to the different track gauges in the East, which differed from those in Western or Central Europe. Very often, Germans were forced to use trucks instead of trains, but trucks could carry fewer materials and consumed precious fuel. Fuel was one of the scarce resources strictly rationed in Germany. Even when logistics were functioning adequately, fuel resources in the Reich were limited and had to be rationed. In the autumn of 1941, the front of Army Group Center was advancing towards Moscow. The troops of Army Group South captured Kiev and moved towards Kharkov and Rostov. Army Group North reached Leningrad. Under these conditions, the supply lines of the Wehrmacht stretched up to 900 kilometers in length. The already severely weakened and damaged motorized transport was unable to handle them. These were strategic supply routes that should have been primarily serviced by rail. At the tactical level, German infantry divisions relied on horse-drawn carts for supply operations. These carts shuttled between the front line and the rear field supply depot. However, supplies were also delivered to these depots by trucks, which should have transported them from the nearest railway station. Often, due to railway issues between Warsaw and the Eastern Front, a column of trucks traveled carrying ammunition, food, and fuel to the forward supply depots. Then, horse-drawn carts retrieved materials from these depots and delivered them directly to specific divisions. One of the viewers in the previous video pointed out in the comments that the German army also had a large number of horse-drawn carts. That's correct. However, horses were used to transport goods between the rear depot and the division at the front, covering a distance of about 15 kilometers. Longer distances were typically covered by trucks, although there were cases where horse-drawn carts had to travel much longer distances as a strategic means of transport. In preparing for Barbarossa, the Germans realized they did not have a sufficient number of trucks to supply the entire army. Therefore, they began taking trucks from infantry divisions and reallocating them to strategic transport columns. Some of the trucks taken from infantry divisions were compensated with horse-drawn carts. These carts were often requisitioned from conquered territories, mainly from Poland, along with their drivers against their will. Furthermore, the expansion of the German army from 100 divisions to 200, and later even 300 divisions, meant that an increasingly smaller number of trucks had to service a larger number of motorized divisions. This led infantry divisions to relinquish even more trucks in favor of motorized divisions or strategic transport columns. They increasingly became dependent on horse-drawn carts, replacing parts of the trucks with horse-drawn wagons in infantry divisions, exacerbated the disparity in speed between armored and motorized divisions versus infantry divisions. As mentioned earlier, the Germans calculated that they needed 60,000 tons of materials daily for the army. Therefore, tactical or operational truck transport was sacrificed in favor of strategic transport. They deemed that transport columns for the entire army were more crucial than those for individual divisions, even if it came at the expense of these divisions' efficiency on the battlefield. Theoretically, the Germans created a truck system that could supply the German army in the east. However, over the vast distances from Germany to the front lines near Moscow, it proved entirely inadequate. The Germans consumed hundreds of thousands of tons of gasoline servicing strategic truck columns. When combined with the losses suffered on the front lines, this eventually led to the German army losing its combat capability. It wasn't winter or mud that caused the collapse of the German offensive towards Moscow, but rather the extent of the losses sustained by Germany since June 1941 and the inability to replenish these losses and supplies due to logistical breakdown. Supplies did not arrive quickly enough to sustain further offensive operations. Weather conditions contributed, but the primary issue was the enormous distance and the failure of supplies to reach the front lines promptly. Even when the roads froze due to frost and mud, there was no improvement in the supply situation for the Wehrmacht because their logistical system was inefficient. Supplies arrived too slowly and in insufficient quantities. The Germans assumed that the pace of their advance would be so rapid that they needed to rely on strategic truck columns. However, after 3 months, it turned out to be impractical due to fuel consumption and damage to the trucks. They concluded that the railway must indeed be the primary strategic means of transportation. Another significant problem emerged. The Germans were unable to reconcile the blitzkrieg warfare with the rapid expansion of railways in the occupied territories of the USSR to support the military. Blitzkrieg, the tactic that allowed the Third Reich to occupy a large part of the European continent, had a hidden flaw that eventually became the Achilles heel of the German army. Blitzkrieg was effective up to a maximum of 400 kilometers. Beyond this range, it could not be sustained. Additionally, if the opponent continued to offer fierce resistance, as the Soviet Union did in the east, maintaining such a rapid and large-scale offensive was impossible without a well-functioning railway system. As mentioned earlier, one of the problems was the different rail gauge in the USSR compared to Europe. The Germans had to adapt the Soviet railway system to the European standard. Military railway units were tasked with this adaptation, but their numbers were insufficient, given the size of the army and the length of supply lines due to the vast occupied territory. Germany expanded and rebuilt railway lines, adjusting the gauge of tracks or adapting captured rolling stock to their needs. However, there was a minimal amount of the latter, as the Soviets managed to evacuate most of their rolling stock, along with the industry to the east. Nevertheless, Germany failed to expand the railway network sufficiently to deliver an adequate supply to their armies, which could continue to conduct a rapid and effective offensive in the east. The Germans rebuilt and expanded the railway lines, but they still failed to gather and transport enough ammunition, fuel, new tanks, and fresh soldiers in sufficient numbers. They couldn't manage this even by the time of their last offensive operations in 1941, particularly during Operation Typhoon. They began the operation aimed at capturing Moscow without having sufficiently developed logistical support. Although they achieved stunning victories, inflicting enormous losses on the enemy, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and advancing hundreds of kilometers, they had to halt after about 3 weeks due to logistical issues. The German railway system could not provide the necessary supplies to the German army, which had penetrated several hundred kilometers into the Soviet Union and became stuck there. Germany, to some extent, managed to restore the capabilities of the railway system, but they never fully resolved the issue. The problem intensified most notably during the first 6 months after the start of Barbarossa. This period was the most critical, as Germany attempted to overcome the Soviet Union during this time. When they failed to do so, in 1942 on the Eastern Front, they did not carry out such large offensives due to logistical issues until the summer. In June 1942, Germany launched Operation Fall Blau and advanced towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. It was a smaller-scale offensive compared to Barbarossa or Typhoon. Yet logistical issues similar to the previous year reappeared. Their advancing troops moved hundreds of kilometers away from the supply base. Germany reached the Caucasus just as they did the year before with Moscow, but they became stuck there because the logistics did not ensure adequate supplies. Logistical issues once again hindered their progress. There was not enough fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements sent to sustain their operations. On the other hand, the Red Army in 1941 and 1942 fought on their own territory, withdrawing deeper into their country. In the interwar period, the Soviet Union not only built tanks, airplanes, and artillery, but also extensively developed its railways, which, upon the outbreak of war, were efficient enough for the Soviet leadership to evacuate most of the industry to the east, utilizing the intact railway networks. As they retreated, they shortened their supply lines. Conversely, as the Germans advanced, they moved further away from their base, industry, and centers of power. General Halder mentions this in his report, to which I refer. However, the further east the Wehrmacht advanced, the longer the route from German factories to the front for tanks became. Russian tanks, produced near Stalingrad and other cities farther east, had shorter routes. In 1941, after 3 weeks of the German invasion, the Red Army lost over 11,000 tanks. Many books mention that Red Army soldiers did not want to fight and abandoned tanks en masse. This is true, but tank crews abandoned their tanks not because they did not want to fight, but because they ran out of gasoline, which could not be replenished because the logistical system completely collapsed in the first months of the war. This was also a reason for the massive losses suffered by the Soviet Union in armored equipment in 1941 and 1942. Hitler is said to have told General Guderian that if he had known the Russians had so many tanks, he would never have started this campaign. Before the invasion, the Germans estimated the number of Soviet tanks at a maximum of 15,000. It is said that the Red Army had even 20,000 tanks before the war. By the end of 1941, the German army had also destroyed about 20,000 Soviet tanks. They destroyed tanks, but did not destroy the factories where these tanks were produced. They did not have such capabilities. Also, their resource and recruitment base largely remained intact. Therefore, they were able to continuously rebuild their combat potential enough to continue to effectively resist. Later, in 1943 and 1944, when the Soviets began their own offensive operations, they received huge supplies under the Lend-Lease program: fuel, lubricants, engines, tanks, and trucks. This last element allowed the Red Army to build what the Germans tried to do: strategic or at least operational transport columns. This significantly modernized their army. American trucks alone constituted over 50% of their operational capacity in terms of cargo transported. However, in 1943 and 1944, as the Red Army advanced, they faced the same problem that the Wehrmacht had in 1941 and 1942. They began to move away from their railway network, and motor transport would not be able to serve the Red Army well. In the years 1944-1945, this dependence on logistics was even greater because the Red Army was conducting offensive operations. Such actions require gathering a sufficient amount of ammunition, necessitating monthly logistical preparations. Therefore, all Red Army operations in 1943, 1944, and 1945 were somewhat limited. Even if we look closely at Operation Bagration, which began on the Belarusian-Russian border and ended 6 weeks later on the border of East Prussia, it was due to logistical issues. Once again, the railway network needed to be expanded. However, the Soviet Union had much greater logistical capabilities than in 1941 and 1942 due to the significant deployment of trucks. The logistics of the Wehrmacht and the logistics of the Red Army were wholly based on railways. This was indeed the primary means of transportation for the armies of these two powers during World War II. The importance of motorization did increase, but the absolutely crucial means of logistical support was still railway transport. It was impossible to conduct an effective offensive on the Eastern Front during World War II without access to a well-functioning railway line. This ultimately stifled the Germans in 1941, when they conducted the offensive to the east during Operation Barbarossa, or later during Operation Typhoon. Due to the shortcomings of the railway system, they had to rely largely on motor or air transport, which consumed fuel and was not as efficient as rail transport. The Red Army, just like the Wehrmacht, was primarily dependent on railway transport, which meant that in the latter half of the war, the Red Army advanced through Europe in leaps and bounds. Logistics determine efficiency on the battlefield. Without it, any army will grind to a halt, even if the enemy has small forces and weak defenses. Similarly, the Americans halted their advance after liberating France in September 1944. In the case of supplying the Allied armies, especially the United States, the situation was more complex due to the additional obstacle of the Atlantic Ocean. The logistical challenges faced by the United States were greater than those of other countries involved in the war. Initially, the Americans had to transport their army to Europe by sea and then continuously supply it. To achieve this, they had to create a vast transport fleet, which needed protection during voyages to effectively move an unimaginable mass of troops and equipment from one continent to another. In theory, ships had to transport supplies to ports where they were unloaded. In ports, the supplies were transferred to trains and then transported to the rear areas of the army. Subsequently, they were loaded onto trucks that finally reached the front lines. However, when the Western Allies landed in France in June 1944, they did not possess any ports at the time of invasion. Therefore, they created artificial ports to unload supplies directly onto the beaches. They accomplished this with a gigantic fleet of transport ships and landing craft. Many actual ports were destroyed, necessitating their reconstruction. Cherbourg Port was relatively quickly captured, but was damaged due to fighting and was far from the front lines. The Allies also had a limited number of railway lines available because they had been destroyed as part of the preparations before the invasion of France to hinder German supply. After liberating France, they had to rebuild it. Upon reaching the Franco-German border, logistical problems arose. In 1944, the Americans from Cherbourg had to use trucks to supply the troops fighting on the Franco-German border until the city of Antwerp was unblocked. Despite being the largest and most motorized army in the world, the American army did not have a sufficient number of supplies to conduct intense, large-scale offensive operations, nor did they have enough trucks and spare parts to transport these supplies. They attacked an exhausted enemy, yet this led to prolonged, resource-intensive battles. They faced logistical issues despite their transport column efficiency being significantly better than their German counterparts. Some divisions covered a distance of 600 kilometers in the offensive, repeating what Marshal von Bock's forces did in June 1941 when they reached Smolensk. Von Bock's forces halted at Smolensk a month after the invasion of the USSR began, remaining there for another 2 months. Logistics could not provide sufficient supplies. Truck columns reached their peak capacity. The railway was not yet adapted and sufficiently expanded. This same issue led to the halt of Patton's, Montgomery's, and Hodges' armies in September 1944. On the Western Front, the Allies reached the German border and stopped due to logistical breakdown. In both cases, the breakdown was not complete. Supplies continued to arrive, but were insufficient given the scale of needs. A fully motorized American division could consume up to 600 tons of supplies per day. Like the Germans, the Americans had a system of motorized supply companies. By late summer, these were also not sufficiently efficient. The Americans were forced into a similar move as the Germans did in preparation for Barbarossa. The Germans would take trucks from divisions and transfer them to strategic transport columns. The Americans did the same. They retained several divisions in Normandy, took their trucks, and also transferred them to a strategic supply line called the Red Ball Express. This is an example that sometimes a division containing tanks and soldiers is less necessary than the trucks that are part of these divisions. Despite such efforts, the Allied armies were unable to continue advancing deep into the Reich because they lacked sufficient materials. Therefore, although the American army reached the German border in September, they then fought for 6 months to break through the Western Wall and reach the Rhine. The Allies liberated France in 3 months, and only afterward, after 6 months, reached the Rhine, not due to enemy resistance, although we cannot completely discount it, but primarily due to logistics inefficiency. The Allies began to improve it. It took them 6 months, after which they managed to execute an effective strike deep into Germany. Staying on the Western Front, the German offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944 is a very specific case. The Germans had gathered large stocks of gasoline for this operation, which were located in Army field depots in the rear. However, they were unable to transport this fuel to their divisions on the front due to road congestion and Allied air operations isolating the battlefield. Despite having fuel in the rear, they couldn't transport it to the front. Therefore, later on, the Americans destroyed their own gasoline depots to prevent the Germans from capturing them. The Germans hoped they would be able to continue the offensive once they captured American depots. However, they did not know their exact locations. It is a myth, however, that they intended to conduct the Ardennes offensive solely on captured fuel. In reality, they had plenty of fuel. It simply wasn't available on the front because logistics are decisive. There is no army immune to logistical problems. Every army was completely dependent on logistics. If we look for an army that cared the least about logistics, it was the Japanese army. It could function without logistics at the level of loose subunits when supplies couldn't reach the occupied island. The combat effectiveness of such units without operational level logistics was very low. Without a sufficient amount of ammunition, fuel, and food, it is impossible to effectively fight and conduct bold operations. It should be realized that when imagining efficient armies capable of sustained combat operations and capable of regenerating their combat potential, logistical factors should not be underestimated. When an army accumulates or purchases a certain number of aircraft and tanks, it is also important to ask how many heavy trucks it has, how the warehouse system is being expanded, whether it has the ability to deploy railway and road bridges, and how efficient its railway system is. This is called an army system. An army or war must be considered in a holistic dimension. World War II showed us that a commander could accomplish a mission due to combat potential, but also because of maintaining that combat potential. A properly functioning logistical system is an essential element of this. It depends on whether a tank will advance, whether a soldier will shoot a rifle, and whether an airplane will drop bombs. Both potential and plans must adapt to logistics. Often battles looked one way rather than another, largely due to logistical issues. Often, both sides of the conflict underestimated the impact of logistics on strategy or operational art. That's all we have prepared for you today. If you liked it, please consider subscribing to the channel, click the like button, and writing a comment in the section below. I wish you a nice day.